I'm absolutely honored to have today Dr. Jose Prado, professor of sociology at California State, Dominguez Hills. His international work includes um, Latitudes de Latinidad, a summer academic semester in Cuba. Hopefully, I said that right. My viewers will know him from his engaging, informative study of Karl Marx's Capital. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing well. One of your studies um, you mentioned going home
Hmm.
after a hard day's work,
Uh,
and in I believe construction or something like with your
yeah,
father.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you painted a really relatable, vivid image
Hmm.
to show, like, I think that your point was like that no one understands that the rules of the road are governed by outside bodies. And then you
Yeah,
later on in that very same study um, talked about like a market where people understand the
yeah,
banking forces, like right there in the moment. They don't see
yeah,
all the forces
yeah.
that are controlling it. So that, I mean, I would just like to know more about your background and your story and how you got from in that car or from in that truck,
Yeah,
riding back from a hard day's work
yeah.
to today as a professor.
Well, that's interesting. It's uh, that's a that's a very provoking question for me. A question that I enjoy very much because it uh, allows me to put a series of things together, and um, I can't help it. I always get sentimental about this stuff because you know so much of my intellectual work today, so much of my uh, academic work and work that I do outside of the scope of um, my profession um, is is linked to the I don't know if this is the right way of putting it, but certainly the existential dilemmas that I confronted, especially as a child moving into adolescence. You know, as an 11 and 12-year-old child, moving into adolescence, 13 and 14 years old. You know, I worked. You know, is something that I often share. Uh, I worked with my dad. Um, uh, I maybe I got in his way more often than I worked when I was very very young. You know, my dad was taking me to work when I was about 7 years old. You know, I'd go on the weekends to work with my dad or to get in his way. But uh, just as soon as I was strong enough and big enough, you know, to run errands and to haul things and then to carry things and then to hold things and to tape things and then to nail things, etc. Um, of course, I was fatigued and I disliked it very much. You know, I wanted to be out and on the weekends with my friends. You know, I wanted to be out having fun with my friends in the summer. Um, and my father asked me one day if, you know, in his consciousness, of course, uh, my father hasn't read Capital. um, so I'll put that on the table. Uh, but my father asked me one day to unload the sheets of drywall from the truck, and for me, it seemed like an eternity. You know, I was about 13 years old, 14 years old, and I was unloading sheets of drywall from the truck and stacking them and stocking, you know, the wherever it is that we were working. And my father asks me if, and of course, he asked me with you know, rhetorically, sarcastically, he asked me if I liked what I had just done.
Hmm.
And of course I didn't, And he said to me, he said, well, then then So couple that particular moment with um, uh, other moments where people who may not have read Capital, but were in one way or another um, moved by its logic, uh, uh, touched by other people who had read the book. And I'm thinking now, of course, about my high school teachers and a few in particular, Chicano high school teachers who I had in the early 80s, who were, somewhere around 30 years old or so. They were young guys, relatively speaking, and so they must have been university students, in the late 60s, early 70s, and were, in fact, I know for a fact that one of my high school teachers was involved in university Chicano student politics, and so these things, converged, and a whole series of seemingly disparate experiences converged, and I became a bilingual teacher. I was teaching grade school. I'm sorry, I was teaching high school. But then I started to teach also. I did adult ed, taught junior high, and then one of the things that we did when we were undergraduate students is we would share books, or at least share titles of books, because I don't remember reading the whole a whole book when I was a university student, unfortunately. But one of the books that I did take up seriously once I graduated from college was a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then, of course, having read that book and then putting my experiences within the context of the narrative in that book, and then putting my own professional work within the context, within a historical context, became very exciting for me and very empowering and strengthening. And one thing led to another. I pursued graduate studies. At the time, I wanted to obtain a PhD in education. I had just, in fact, around the time that I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I actually had the very, very, very good fortune of attending 2 talks given by its author. And so it was very illuminating. It was a very illuminating moment, or they were very illuminating moments, I should say. And so, these things influence, or these experiences influenced me greatly. And at one point, I remember, I don't know if he ever got the letter, but I wrote Paulo Freire a letter, asking him about his book. And I never got a response. Who knows if he got the letter? But I was just so moved. I sent him a letter, and I decided that what I really needed to do was to, go in deep, and the trajectory of my training has been such that I started in an area called Sociology of Education. And so that, of course, has taken me to a series of readings and conversations such as this one, and such as those that I've had with Matt over the last few months. And frankly, if I am to understand work, if I am to understand the work that is done in these things called classrooms, or the work that is done now in these things called, or through these things called computers, I need to, I need to read Capital. And so anyway, that's kind of how, that's kind of how I got to this Sunday morning.
Wow, an inspiring story. Um, I, I don't know. I like the way you lay things out there. Like it starts. It's almost like reading like a poem or a book. You start with something, build on, and then it all comes together at the
Yeah.
end. That's impressive. Let's see. So I think before we talk about the study, I have a pressing question.
Sure.
I let's see. I attended two different colleges here in North Carolina, Greensboro, Guilford College and University of North Carolina at Greensboro,
Okay.
and I was primarily just using student loans to be an activist.
Okay.
And I got about 3-4 years in and decided I don't want to teach in the school system in the South in North Carolina, giving the material, and so I butted heads with a lot of my professors, coming at from a working class Marxist perspective, and they like one time I was told that I couldn't quote Engels and stuff like that is is a secondary source of that time period, and like I got a lot of resistance. Usually, if you watch Fox News, they'll be like that they'll say that the universities are a hotbed for radical anti-fa Marxism, and when I went,
I wish.
and then when I went to college, I think the most searing moment for me was with my experience with academia was the invasion of Libya, where I was against, I'm against war. I'm against working class people, poor black and brown working class people going to kill other poor black and brown working class people and destroying people's countries for the benefit, of capitalists. And I let a student speak out against it. I tried to get people around it, and through my organizing, the sociology head professor led a informational session defending the invasion of Libya. Defending the invasion of Libya, saying how it was necessary humanitarian intervention. And I was just wow. So what has been your experience as someone who would study Marx as an academia?
Sisyphean. Sisyphean. And I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, because sometimes the boulders that I push up the hill aren't boulders. I just, it's just one guy, and sometimes I'm not strong enough, so sometimes they're not boulders, sometimes they're rocks. Sometimes my distractions are so great that when I'm pushing up a hill, sometimes just amounts to a stone, the kind of stone you'd put in a slingshot or something like that, But, your question is a very important one, and it makes me think about experiences in which I have been involved, where I've confronted people who initially presented themselves to be my colleagues, for instance, and I've challenged such people, and it's interminable, but it's necessarily interminable. It's frankly, it's the kind of work that needs to take place if a collectivist understanding about existence is to amplify and expand itself. we need to constantly, frankly, we need to constantly be agitating one way or another. And to the extent that we can, of course, we need to pick our battles very strategically and engage in battles because we like to battle, or engage in battles because there is a prospect of victory down the road. Um, so I suppose an illuminating a kind of battle in which I found myself once, and one that really is just a really shed light on things for me, because I was a high school teacher. Then I was a high school teacher, and I was teaching literature, and we were reading Tocqueville's, Who is an American, or What is an American, right? And we were reading this book. I'm sorry, we were doing this reading just a couple years after the invasion of Panama, right? And so what I asked my high school students to consider was the question, and then to compare and contrast the answers to this question from the perspective of Tocqueville and Panamanians, and I asked them to arrive at a conclusion for themselves. So this is the sort of stuff that I was doing as a high school teacher. And then, since you ask about the response, or at least that's what I think you were asking about, the response and how it's shaped my working relationship with folks. Word was, of course, getting out, that I was doing this kind of stuff in the classroom. And, not ironic, of course, because, of course, the guardians of culture in high school are often the faculty in the English department, right? So I remember there was a high school English teacher, and I saw him. He was standing outside my door. And he didn't see that I saw him, but I saw him standing outside my door, and he was there for some time. The next day, I get called into the principal's office. And the principal says to me, we're getting some complaints about your work. Parents are complaining about what you're teaching their kids. And I'm thinking to myself, of course, I know where this is going. I know how I know how I ended up here. And I know who was eavesdropping. And I'm certainly not disparaging, the parents of my students, but the parents of my students in an East LA high school had more pressing concerns, having to do with work, childcare, et cetera, than to be leafing through the curriculum, let alone understanding the curriculum. Because most of the kids that I was working with were kids at the time whose main language at home was Spanish. So I said to the principal, I said, don't lie. I was being, I forget the teacher's name, was eavesdropping in my class. I know what you're, and of course I called her on her bluff. And then, of course, I was harassed in one way or another throughout the remainder of the year. But I was especially interested in doing this kind of work because, of course, it was around the time that I was reading not just Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but some of the other work, tied to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I was reading this stuff and I was getting informed by this stuff, and I was trying to bring it into the classroom. So I don't know if I've answered your question as you'd like, but that's kind of illustrative of the kind of experiences that I've had over the and I've been working in schools one way or another. Even as an undergraduate student, I started to work in schools. So I've been working in schools since 1986. So, as an after-school instructor, as a coordinator of an after-school program, as an assistant director of an after-school program, as a high school teacher, as a junior high teacher, adult ed. Of course, I've taught university now. The only thing I haven't done is teach city college. That's the only thing I haven't done. So there's your answer.
Great answer. Very powerful and a good example that gave me a perspective, a better perspective on your struggle in education. So let's get into the study with Matt Cedillo. Shout out to Matt Cedillo and his book of poetry.
Yes.
Very good stuff.
Great poetry.
How did that study start? Who arranged it? How have you enjoyed doing it? And tell us a little more about it.
Sure. I saw Matt perform some years ago, and I was floored. I was, wow, this guy's heavy duty, man. I love it. I saw him perform or recite, and of course, his name is floating around in the Southern California area generally, and the LA area specifically, especially as far as Chicano poetry is concerned. His name is he's well known. He's well known, and deservedly so, of course. And as it turns out, he was collaborating. In fact, he put together a show at a community art space where he's doing some work, and he did that show collaboratively, or I forget the actual details. But anyways, he's done work with a close colleague, and so him last year in April or so at a conference, and as it turned out, we were on the same panel at this particular conference. And following this connection that I made with him, I stayed in touch with him, and then I invited him to present with me at a conference in La Habana at Casa de las Americas. And so we organized a panel, and Luis Rodriguez, another very well-known writer, poet, joined us. Viva Padilla joined us. Iris de Anda. Shout out to Iris de Anda, whose work is great. Shout out to Viva Padilla, whose work is great. Shout out to Luis, of course, Luis. Shout out to you all do excellent work. As a matter of fact, their work was very well received in La Habana at Casa de las Americas, and so I've stayed in touch with Matt in different ways. I've talked to him, and sometimes we just shoot the shit. So around the time that this pandemic explodes, or rather around the time that we are alerted to the existence of this pandemic, I proposed to Matt that we read Capital, and that we read it with the intent to inform specifically inform, although of course it's not limited to the people that I was thinking about, but certainly I was very interested to inform folks from the Chicana and Chicano community about this work, so that we could put our lives within a particular context, as far as work, right? I think that, and Matt and I concur. As a matter of fact, there is this, and it's hegemonic, and it's certainly not simply, the condition of Chicana and Chicano existence, or an aspect of the condition of Chicana and Chicano existence, but certainly culturalist understandings um, uh, that are divorced from the practical, tangible, empirical conditions of people's lives, are often used to make sense of the dilemmas in which they find themselves. And so I knew that I could turn to capital, for instance, to make sense of the relationship between the structures of society and, of course, the ideologies in society. I knew that I could turn to capital to understand, then, to continue to be a little more jargonistic. I knew that I could turn to capital in order to see the relationship between, the base and superstructure, right? In other words, to see the relationship between the economic conditions of our lives, how much money some people make and how little money other people make, where people are contained in as far as work is concerned, and then the opportunities for employment in other areas for other categories of people, and then of course the relationship between these very tangible, basic things, and then the school system, and how it is the school system as one of these channels where ideologies and understandings and norms and ideas and certainly ideas about both good and bad, and success and failure, etc. That we could turn to capital, so that I might engage Matt, and Matt might engage me, and you might engage me, and I might engage you, and other people can engage one another to see how things come to be normal, right? And then, of course, to use a Marxian quote that I read some time ago, to see how it is we might make the strange normal, right? And the normal strange. I mean, that's one of the quotes that's always stuck on my mind. But anyway, I don't know. I have a tendency to keep on talking, because the question is so provoking and thought provoking. So do interrupt me, please, if you need to bring me back into line with the questions that you're asking.
No, that was a very good answer. I think you were getting at like why to study capital and how it's helped you.
Yeah.
But like, how has been the experience of doing it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're asking me about capital as curriculum, I think that's where you're headed with the question. Correct me if I misunderstand, but if I don't misunderstand, I read something some time ago, and maybe it was a video that I was watching. I don't recall if I read bell hooks or if I heard bell hooks say this, but she says, professors, this is bell hooks talking, of course. She says many professors, cultivate their lives and cultivate the lives of their families, and hold great regard and and hold high expectations for themselves and high expectations for people that are close to them, but they don't bring that regard, nor do they bring those expectations to the classroom. And so that's my experience as an educator now for over 30 years, well over 30 years, is such that I generally I concur with that observation that Bell Hooks made in this particular incident. And then coupled to that particular understanding is another one. Of course, my students over the last 15 years have predominantly been Chicana and Chicano students. Of course, I've worked with here in Southern California. The proportion of Central American people has increased significantly over the last 30 years. So I'm not just working with Chicana and Chicano students. I'm working with Central American people whose families are from Central America, and working as I do in what had up until 1992 been called South Central LA, right? I also work with Black students, although unfortunately the proportion of Black students at my university has dropped considerably over the last 10 years or so. Anyway, so getting back to this understanding about low expectations for racial minority university students, it seems to me that if the university is not a space for intellectual excellence, it seems to me that if the university is not a space for intellectual challenge, then it's appropriate that excellence, intellectual excellence, academic excellence, literary excellence, and corresponding challenges need to make their way in the different spaces where students and young people and anybody actually who's interested in literature, or anybody that's interested in learning, or is interested in theory, right? Or is certainly interested in making, or is certainly interested in reflecting on their lives, or the condition of their lives, right? Our challenge then is to find ourselves in those spaces, because I certainly, and as I shared at the outset of our talk this morning, Dust, I certainly have done what I could to expand my consciousness and cultivate my consciousness and challenge myself, and I've certainly profited from it, and I've certainly had very wonderful and interesting opportunities throughout my life. This interview being one of them. I'm humbled and I'm honored. Working with Matt is another one. Working with Luis is another one. Working with Viva is another one. Working with Edie, these are just wonderful opportunities. Not to mention all the other things that I've done throughout my life over the last 30 years. And I've done much, right, to bring such experiences to my own children, in keeping with Bell Hooks' observations. Am I to put a border? Am I to patrol those opportunities away from my students? Of course not. So I'm, como una hormiga, like an ant, who is trying to get to the ant hole, right? And if there's a barrier in one spot, well, what does that ant do? That ant, looks far away to get to his or her objective. And such explains, some of the work that I do. um, and hopefully my work is inspiring. Hopefully, and not just my work, but really the discussions to which I contribute. Uh, Hopefully, they infect folks. I've certainly been touched. As I mentioned, I was floored. I was amazed. I was enchanted. I was compelled, and it's become a life journey for me, frankly. Um, Being engaged in discussion with people like uh, some of Paulo Freire's students. It's been a long time, and she may not remember me, but I was in discussion with Antonia Darder, for instance. Excuse me, I was in discussion with Antonia Darder, and she was one of Freire's students, and so carrying on the torch, as the saying goes. And so unfortunately, perhaps, I don't know, I've had to resort to Facebook. I don't know what you think about that, but but if some other day I'll do. It's just Facebook is just the instrument. It's not the goal. It's not the object. It's just the instrument.
Wow. That's a wealth of knowledge. I kind of have a pressing question given your work. I was researching you, and I did that quick video about um, that seminar in Cuba,
Oh,
and
yeah.
one of the questions was, "What is an American?"
Uh,
And then you raise that again here. What is an American? And I've started this YouTube show where I do a weekly address.
yeah.
Like I all I did I got out of activism for a while,
You got
and
out of what? I'm sorry.
activism. Like I was active in college in activism and
Oh, okay.
studied. Okay, and then I just worked for a while, and
Okay.
now I'm trying to get back into it, and I started this YouTube show. And when I first started the YouTube show, I called it Dust James Weekly Assault on U.S. Empire, and that's a little bit
Uh,
wordy. And I actually I was going to be interviewed with Cindy Sheehan,
mm,
the great anti-imperialist, and
yes, of course, of
this
course.
this was right before George Floyd was lynched. And I tried to talk with Cindy Sheehan, and my connection was bad because I was in the truck and I didn't plan it very well.
Yeah.
And and I got through like a little portion of the interview, and then my signal went out, and then things blew up, and I never heard from her again.
Uh,
And in response to that, I changed the name of my show, and I changed it to Anti-Imperialist America because
oh, yeah.
it's short, it's quick, it gets out there. And
Yeah.
I understand that America was who's a the person America was named after a colonizer.
Right.
Obviously, it's a loaded term, and the United States as a government has been an imperialist force, which stole the land and oppresses Chicano people to this day, along with the African Americans and the working class in
Yeah.
general. But I think there's different Americas, like and the kind like when someone from the United States, regardless of their skin color, they go to other states, they're called an American.
Uh,
I mean, that's just what I mean,
yeah.
there's a lot of problems with that term. Like all of the continent could be considered America,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that might be insulting because it's not an indigenous name. But what I'm trying to do, in my perspective of anti-imperialist America, what I'm trying to do with the show is I'm trying to highlight voices from the continent, or
Yeah.
particularly the area that's called the United States or claimed as the United
Yeah.
States, to highlight the voices of resistance,
Yeah.
of people considered Americans for living there. John Brown, Harriet Tubman, Brown Berets, Black Panthers, like Union
Lord.
leaders, William Z. Foster,
Yeah.
Eugene Debs, people like that,
Yeah.
and like a new vision for a better America that's not
Yeah.
full of oppression and imperialism, and like changing it to something that isn't that. Like
Yeah.
what's your perspective or thoughts on that?
You know,
What
it's it it's it's a very simple uh, uh, experience that has been the the match Um, I should say before I answer your question that um, there are great opportunities uh, for uh, understanding the world in some of the uh, most unexpected places. And certainly one of those unexpected places in, you know, here in the United States is um, the is in the kitchens or around the kitchen table or on the living room couch in a Mexican family's home. So I'll start there, and and uh, and I remember being finding myself in conversation with my dad, and um, and then also my mom. You know, and of course I don't remember the exact location, but certainly it was home. Um, and and I remember learning, you know, that when they were kids, now I know exactly where this conversation took place. I was on the kitchen table and I had a homework assignment, and my homework assignment was to draw a map, right? And so I was drawing the map, and my dad and my mom were telling me that that there wasn't 7 continents, that there's only 5 continents. And I said, "What? There's only 5 continents?" They said, "Yeah, when we went to school, we were told that there's only 5 continents. There aren't 7 continents. There's no such thing as North America. There's no such thing as Central America, and there's no such thing as South. It's all America, you know." And for that matter, I must have been about 9 or 10 years old, you know. And for that matter, my father said to me, "We are Americans. As a matter of fact, we are the first Americans. We are the Americans, and those people who have co-opted the term are not Americans. We are Americans, you know." And I remember going to school. I remember going to school with this newfound knowledge, you know, newfound understanding, very invigorating, very empowering notion, and sharing it. And then, of course, it's been the story of my life, you know, shedding light on things, and then, you know, being told that, you know, that I've got it all wrong, and, you know, why don't I just get with the program and things will be things will be okay. Anyway, so I'll start with that, right? In terms of this particular question, and then in the more theoretical, perhaps, certainly the more historical sense, certainly the more political sense. Um, in addition to recognizing that America is a continent, in addition to recognizing that some people have been American, for if this term is to be used, that some people have been American for thousands of years, and then ironically, the people that have only been American for a couple hundred years, if that much, have, you know, have taken the boots away from Indian, Mexican, and black cowboys and put them on themselves. You know, have appropriated the cowboy hat. And much as they've done this, right, they've also appropriated language in this particular way. Um, so, uh, if that's the case, also, and if we can turn to Cuban philosopher, Cuban poet, Cuban revolutionary, independence fighter, if we can turn our attention to Latin American liberation movements that span the centuries, and if we can, for the moment, find a culminating spot in the work of Jose Marti, then we ought to take into consideration how it is that we might take the word back and infuse it with the kind of definitions that you're talking about, right? And certainly understand that we are people of various backgrounds, but in our pursuit of truth, in our pursuit of justice, in our pursuit of collectivist, socialistic, scientific command of our lives, we ought to, we ought to give that term a new name. We ought to harness it. We ought to reharness it. And do so in ways that are liberating. I don't know of a word that is not fraught with misunderstanding. I don't know of terms that are devoid of dilemmas and crises and contradictions. I do know that the word America is might be tied to, as we were often told in school, tied to Amerigo Vespucci, might be tied to Leif, Leif Americ. I think it was a Scandinavian sailor. I've also heard that the word America is a Native American word. I don't know which of the three it is, to be quite honest with you. But I do know that it's one continent, and I am original to this continent, and I've been touched by history, as we all have, but I've got a particular relationship to history, and I've got a particular presence in history, and I want to make an impact, and other people want to make an impact. And so on the basis of the words and the understandings that we take up, we might make the kind of impact that and leave the kind of legacy for other people that we want to leave. And so this is the more general set of parameters, right, with which this particular question that you ask me is approached.
Wow, that's great. There was a lot there. Part of your story about I really that's a one point you made that's not really pointed out is that how cowboy boots and cowboy hats were culturally appropriated
Yes.
from indigenous people, Mexican people, and I have an interesting story about that.
Yes.
And I'm originally from upstate New York. It's up in the hill. Some people would consider it north of Appalachia. It's kind of up in the hills. It's not a lot going on economically there. A little. It's rural, somewhat usually somewhat conservative. Other than that's where Ithaca and Cornell is. Okay. But as you go outside of that area, it's mostly hay fields, dairy farms. And my uncle is a country western musician, and he plays golden hits country, Hank Williams, Johnny Cash, stuff like this.
Yeah.
And he plays it mostly for older folks. And I grew up with some of that music, and I remember the cowboy hats and the boots. And then my family came down to North Carolina, and most of the country
From the
music.
north, they went,
Say again.
from the north, I guess, right? They went
Yeah,
south.
from
Is that?
upstate New York to North Carolina,
Yeah,
because at the same time, this was mid '90s, '95. This was the same time NAFTA passed in '94,
yeah,
and I like to make the point that NAFTA, which destroyed southern Mexico, also hurt small family farms
yeah,
throughout rural America, and had a lot of disposition of
yeah,
people. So we moved down here when I was like 5 years old, and at the same time, a lot of Mexican immigrants came
yeah,
to the state. And I never, when I got down here, like I don't know, country music was more pop because I guess it's more city or whatever, and I didn't really like it. I like the classic country
yeah, yeah,
music, and then and I came from. This is a little painful, but I came from a very dysfunctional home. There wasn't, it wasn't the safest place to be. There was a lot of stress there.
yeah, yeah,
I didn't have all the necessary resources I need. And to get away from that, I'd always go to one of my friends, um, go see one of my friends.
yeah.
And she lived in a trailer park or a neighborhood. And like, other than like one or two families, everybody in that trailer park was from Guerrero, Mexico.
Oh,
And they all worked in the chicken plant.
yeah,
And I started going to parties
yeah.
and with her, and the music was banda music.
Hmm.
And I saw people with the cowboy hats and
It must have. It must have. It must have.
and the boots, and I'm like, huh, what is going on here? And then I started. I actually saw more similarities between the origins of country music here and more the Mexican American, Mexican music in general, or
Yeah,
Mexican regional music. Like some of the same, bass lines and
yeah, yeah,
stuff. And then I learned that history, that it was originally uh,
yeah.
Mexican culture, but I'm still a big fan of um, Mexican regional music. I guess I'll end at one of my favorite groups, Los Tigres del Norte, which me and my wife have gone to every time they come. They come play for the tobacco workers, which is big industry here. And I really love their song "Somos Más Americano," which
Well, there you go.
you
There you.
um,
Yes.
said, and
You know,
I just
it's this. Well, you, because you're where you are, and because you're going where you're going, right? You become familiar with things that don't generally make it to your fifth grade U.S. history curriculum, but certainly we know this, and that's the uh, upsetting part. It's that people surrender in their fetishization for inflated commodities. I can't help but think about Marx in this particular moment. That people surrender. Sometimes people surrender. Uh, uh, Otherwise, more empowering, more meaningful, more significant, more valuable um, understandings and realities and circumstances that can be uh, 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 that can contribute to uh, a different world, right? Uh, One where children are not in cages, uh, one where mothers' children uh, are not kidnapped, uh, one where um, uh, people have the health care that they deserve. Um, if we turn to the best in us, and uh, if we are at least suspicious of the pap right, that is marketed to us, you know, our conditions could be different. Um, and kind of setting that aside for the moment, I don't mean to uh, get back to this particular subject in order to subordinate it to what I've just said, because I think that really uh, I really think that what I've just said a few moments ago is probably uh, the most important motivation of the work that I do. But uh, one is able to arrive at these motivations. One is able to embrace these motivations. And one is able to be moved by these motivations when one understands, right? And then to take it back to the case of the cowboy boots, for instance, right? When one recognizes that Mexican people uh, were part of a pastoral economy uh, west of the Mississippi, black people who had escaped their enslavement integrated this pastoral economy, and Hispanicized Indians or temporarily Hispanic Indians were also a part of this pastoral economy. Uh, and for good or for bad, that's what was taking place in the lives of people, and that's what people were doing to make ends meet for themselves in the 18th century and in the 19th century. Um, and it was as a consequence of the colonization of Mexico, or the consequence of the colonization, what became Mexico, or what was Mexico for some 20 or 30 years, right? That the folks that were sent to colonize this territory took up the not just the land of the people that were there, right, but also took up the subsistence methods. It took up the economy, and then, of course, displaced the people that had been working there the way that they had been working, and took it for themselves. When one knows this, uh, uh, one ought to. It seems to me that one ought to feel compelled to resolve this injustice, and so when one is compelled to resolve this injustice, I guess then one can then imagine a world where such injustices no longer exist, right? And it's my understanding that if we are to move in that direction, I'm not saying it's the only one, but I do believe that it's an important point of departure, and that important point of departure, of course, is capital. You know, again, it's not the only one, but it's a very, very, very important point of departure.
I think that was the hopeful note um, that I was looking to end the show with.
All right.
It's been almost an hour. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it very much.